how it feels a lot of the time for folks. So for me, it wasn't until I was 24 that I was like, okay, I feel pretty confident about this. But I remember having a lot of like different understandings around my gender at like age 10 and 11. Yeah.
Great, thank you. This morning you talked about the pastor in the Lutheran ELCA church and how you drove 3 hours on weekends to wrestle through scripture with him or her. What did that partnership look like, and how did he or she respond?
Yeah, so this morning I was talking about how when I was in college, I was trying to figure out if I wanted to get baptized, because I wasn't baptized as a baby, because I didn't go to a church that did infant baptism. So I got baptized when I was 22, but before that happened, I spent a lot of time talking with my pastor from my home church, that church that was on its way towards being affirming, that I went to as a teenager. And I would go in there with like all these Bible verses highlighted and like the Luther's Small Catechism and the ELCA statement on sexuality, and I would just go in and be like, I just need to understand, like I just need to figure out if I can be here, was really the question I was asking. And that pastor was so kind. He never said like, to my frustration, he never said, this is what the text means. He never did that, even though I really wanted him to do that. He just kept asking questions, and he kept giving me more resources, and whenever I was like, what do you think about this? He'd say, well, here's what I think, but then here are 3 other things that you could read that have different opinions. And I think really like the sort of opening up of the diversity of opinions was so healing, coming from a tradition that was like, there's one right way and one right way only. So I think if somebody was in that position with somebody else, I think like the really helpful thing was offering that diversity of, not just diversity of opinions, but diversity of faith experience, I think was really important.
Can you clear the argument of trans ungender dysphoria? Oh, and gender dysphoria, excuse me. Can you clear the argument of trans and gender dysphoria?
I'm not totally sure I understand that one. If you wrote it and you want to elaborate, feel free, but you don't have to. I think one of the things that people ask me a lot about when it comes to gender dysphoria, the whole question of like, is being trans a mental illness, right? Like we figured out a while ago that being gay was not a mental illness, and they took it out of the DSM, the Diagnostic Manual for Mental Health. And just this last version of the DSM, they took out what had been called gender identity disorder before. Gender identity disorder was what you got diagnosed with if you were trans. And they kind of figured out, like, basically we're doing the same thing we did to gay folks, where we're taking this whole identity and understanding of self and being like, you're sick, right? And they realized that wasn't right. And it didn't, like, jive with the medical science they had, so they took that out. The thing that's in the DSM now is called gender dysphoria. And the reason we have it in there in the first place is because if you want to medically transition, if you want to take hormones or you want to have any kind of gender-affirming surgery, you have to have a medical diagnosis in order to do that. It's so doctors and other health practitioners don't get sued. So really, it's about the way that our medical system works, and it's not about somebody having a mental illness. A lot of the times I think about how we don't penalize people with not 20/20 vision for getting glasses, and I feel like a lot of the time transition is basically like getting glasses. You're doing something that makes you a healthier, full person in the world, and sometimes that requires a little medical help, but it doesn't mean that you're broken or that you're sick.
And if that didn't answer the question, again, like
yeah,
Austen
feel free
said,
to come talk to me
to
afterward if you'd like
clarify. Were you baptized Lutheran?
I was, yeah. So I got baptized in a Lutheran church when I was 22, and it was super sweet because it was folks that had known me since I was 15, and they knew that I was bisexual, and that was like a huge thing for me to be like embraced by a congregation that was like, yeah, we know this about you, and we love you. That was great. When I came out as transgender a couple of years later, I came out as trans when I was 24. 25 maybe, and time goes so fast, I'm so old. When I came out as trans, they actually invited me back, so this was an hour from where I live now, they invited me back to speak when the book came out, and having like my old Sunday school teacher come up to me and be like, I'm so proud of you, was amazing, was so cool. So yeah, they're still in my heart, they're my church home still.
How do you feel about the definitions of masculinity and femininity?
I think I wish people knew how varied they were around the world. I think we're really stuck in like masculinity means this and femininity means this. And when you look around like all of human experience, that is it's such a huge sort of like milieu to look at. And the idea, it's a friend of mine, Lynn Young, who's a Native American trans person, two-spirit person, talks about how trying to constrain things to masculinity and femininity is like trying to look at the world through one of those things you make for eclipses, those little pinhole things. Like, what if I just hold this up and look at the world through this? Like, that's what you're doing with gender, right? Like, you could be looking at everything, or you could look through this tiny hole, right? And I kind of think we do that with gender a lot. It's so much bigger than we think. And I think especially, and I mean, I think with women, it comes out in very specific ways. And I now, as somebody who's read as male, like pretty much 100% of the time, I have recently, in the last few years, experienced sort of the masculine version of this. And it's so hard for boys and for young people who are raised as boys and raised as men to be constrained into this sort of cage of like, you can't feel things, you have to be logical all the time, you have to present this way or you're going to get beat up. Like, I don't think it does us very much good to constrain ourselves to those things.
Do you think there's such a thing as someone being too young to change gender?
I think, how do I answer that in a succinct way? I think because it's possible, like our first understandings of gender are usually around like age 2 to 3, like the fact that we're understanding ourselves that early. And also, I think it's important to note, understanding what people are expecting of us and how we should conform to that. I don't think it's too early for any kid to know what their gender is. Like, it's of course going to be evolving. It's not going to stay static. But like, if they're telling you, like, this is how I feel, it's not too early for them to know that. In terms of how early you can transition, I think there's a lot of concern about kids transitioning too young, and that's like, obviously we want to protect our kids. We don't want to do anything that would be bad for them. But I think it's important for people to know that like the very earliest that you could have any sort of medical intervention in terms of transitioning is like right pre-puberty, when you can go on these things called hormone blockers. And hormone blockers essentially press pause on puberty and allow more time for the family to try to figure out what they want to do. And puberty blockers are reversible, so they're not doing any long-term damage to these kids. In terms of like transition that is irreversible, you can't do that until at the earliest age 16, and then only with both parents' consent in certain states. So I think this concern about kids transitioning, like nothing irreversible is happening to them. So if your kid is 6 years old and is telling you about who they are, and they are like, I really want to go to school as me, I don't think there's anything wrong with letting them go to school as themselves, provided you set up like a place that's safe for them to be. Because if your kid comes back to you next year and says, Mom, I think I don't know if I really feel that way anymore, like maybe you'll feel like you went through a hassle, but like it's worth it to have your kid feel like they can tell you who they are, right? So that's just my 2 cents.
Thank you. Can you talk briefly about Christ's scars after the resurrection and the changes trans folk may make to their bodies? Mm-hmm. I've heard you speak before about the nature of our bodies in heaven / post-resurrection. I think it's powerful and helpful to cis allies present, and as well as helping trans folks see themselves in the suffering of Christ.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a story that tell in the book. No, tonight we just went through like literally like 101 stuff, and there's a lot more you can say about affirming passages. But one that comes up a lot is the story of Christ appearing to the disciples after resurrection, the story of doubting Thomas. That one was brought to my attention by a friend of mine named Asher, who I was asking him about his experience, and he was talking about how his church puts a lot of emphasis on heaven and the afterlife, right? And he was like, I've had so many people ask me, like, well, what do you think your body's going to be like in heaven? What do you think your body's going to be like when you get to heaven? And how's that going to look? Is it going to look like you do now, or is it going to look like you did when you were like 14 prior to transition, right? And Asher brought up this story of Jesus appearing to the disciples post-resurrection. And Jesus coming and having these scars and these wounds on his hands and on his side, and the fact that Jesus' body wasn't this perfect, shiny new thing again after resurrection. He still had the scars on his body that told his story. and how important that was for Asher as somebody who had had top surgery, which meant that he gets like 2 cool scars across his chest to kind of go like, hey, our scars tell our stories. And Thomas would not have believed Jesus if Jesus had not said, here are my scars, right? So what would it look like for us to connect our understanding of our bodies and the importance of our bodies and the ways our bodies change as like a positive thing that could connect to Christ showing himself post-resurrection as well. So it's an interesting story, and Asher's story is as well. So
I really like that. In our last one here. If the blind man was created blind to be given the gift of sight by Jesus, if being someone outside of the gender binary is bad, then why did the Lord create the eunuch mentioned in Isaiah?
Ooh, yeah. So this kind of gets to the question of like, or the statement of like God doesn't make mistakes, right? And this idea of God creating people a certain way. That story of the blind man is an interesting one. Jesus sees a blind man on the side of the road, and the disciples ask, who sinned, this person or his parents, that he was made blind? Essentially, like, whose sin caused this terrible thing to happen? And Jesus says, like, sin was not involved here. The blind man is blind because to show the glory of God, essentially. And some people read that, and they read that and say, oh, it was about Jesus healing this blind man and making him have sight again, and that was like the glory that was happening. Now, if you read anything from disability theologians, people in our community that have different disabilities that talk about like disability throughout Scripture, they point to that passage and they go, no, the glory of God was already being shown through this blind person. It was not in his healing. It was in the fact that he was where he was, who he was, that he was meeting Jesus. It wasn't in his healing only. And so there are different ways of understanding that passage, but I think it's an important way of getting into that question of like, why are people trans? Why would God do this, right? And for different trans people are going to have different answers to that question. So I can't say any of this for all trans folks. For me, I think that God made me trans on purpose, even though it was a really hard road. I think God intended for me to be born a certain way, to have an identity that was different from that sex assigned at birth, because I was supposed to have the experiences that I have had. And for me, that's true. Not all trans people are going to feel that way. So it's hard to struggle with like, why would God give us hard things in our lives? But a lot of the LGBTQ plus people I know say that their understanding of being part of a marginalized community has made them way more understanding and compassionate and energetic towards working for the liberation of other people in marginalized communities. And I think there's a lot of gift that comes in that too. Yeah. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. So I'd also like to take a minute to thank our partners. As you probably noticed coming in, several organizations have joined us year in and year out at these events, and they're going to be out in the milling area back there. They're there to answer any questions you have, and they have materials to share with you. As we mentioned, Austin's going to be selling his books back right behind the last pew there. So if you want to get a book, or even if you want to talk to Austin, feel free to go up to that table. We've also got refreshments out in the parlor, and those are there for your enjoyment while you're networking and talking with each other and enjoying the rest of the evening. And one last thing I'll say is please do fill out these cards. We've got ushers that are going to be standing at the end of the aisles that will collect them for you. We would love to hear your thoughts and feedback on tonight and for future events. Thank you.